and Development Review is taking the lead on this. Brian, we lost the slides. All right, there we go.
Sorry, yeah, I had to start recording.
Oh, yes, thank you. Just so we know, yes, it's being recorded because we are going to post these if we want to go back and review, and we will review as well. So thank you very much. Even though we are taking the lead as we help serve the Plan Commission and City Council when it comes to land use matters and the zoning ordinance, it's very important that we're partnering with other city departments and discussing the potential alternatives and also impacts of these policies. So you can see we've had good discussion, robust discussion across the city with a variety of different offices and representatives from those offices. We'll continue to do that as we move forward. All right, next slide. So this all started and is the result of three separate resolutions of intent to cause us to act on these. One was to eliminate parking space minimums, and that was provided by City Council. And the other two were provided by our City Planning Commission, and one was to permit accessory dwelling units, and the other was to revise short-term rental regulations. So these were all passed over the last year and a half and enabled us to move forward on these. These will all ultimately be three separate ordinances that will be discussed separately. But in the interest of time and because they impact each other, we've decided to have our community engagement with them related because as one changes, there may be secondary or tertiary effects on the other two or three. So how we've progressed so far, we've started with initial outreach back in the end of summer, early fall, a variety of different methods, and really providing just an update or information on what was in the resolution, what was the starting point as proposed by each of those resolutions, and really kind of discussing like what each meant in terms of what's the history of parking and what are the requirements and what's proposed. What's an accessory dwelling unit? How could it be potentially used? And what are some regulations involved with that? And then short-term rentals, we do have some ordinances on the book currently. What are some, I'll say, promises and pitfalls with what's there, and how do we move forward with that? So we went through an initial round of outreach. After that, we spent the mid part of autumn working on some focus groups of 8 to 10 people with diverse perspectives to discuss, debate some of the merits of each of the proposals, some concerns that may be related to moving forward with changes to these, and put those together into where we're at today, and that is draft concepts. And what we are doing is sharing draft concepts in a variety of methods as well, really to go through and have a starting point for some productive discussion. And what I do want to emphasize is that this is a starting point. Before we go forth and in phase 4, introduce some draft legislation for our City Plan Commission and City Council to consider, we want to really make sure we're getting the nuts and bolts, the terms and conditions, the regulations right. And so we have a starting point where we're going to propose some things this evening. And we're really looking at this stage, again, to gain additional feedback on, are we right on? Are we just a little bit off, or are we way off? And helping us through these meetings, through an online survey, to really reshape these before they move forward with the legislative process in early next year. And just a little bit about our engagement. The first round involved 3 public meetings, 2 telephone town halls, which is a newer method that we've used and had pretty good success with that. Online surveys, 6 focus groups, and we had over 740 people attending the public meetings. There may be some double counting as people attended multiple meetings, and 562 survey responses. So that data, quantitative and qualitative, was used to help us shape the recommendations, proposals that will be presented this evening. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Brian, who will handle the first of the 3 proposals. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Again, this is Brian Mercer from the Department of Planning and Development Review. And the first zoning change we're going to talk about tonight is eliminating parking space minimums. So before I go into the actual recommendations, I just wanted to give a brief history of parking space requirements in Richmond and how we got to where we are today. And we know Richmond has been around for quite some time, but it really wasn't until the late 1920s where we had our first zoning ordinance. And in that zoning ordinance, it pretty much uh, divided the city into residential, commercial, and industrial uses. There was no reference to any off-street parking requirements. But then as time went on and cars became a little more popular in the 1940s, you start to see a few references to parking requirements. Like if you have a two-family dwelling, you have to provide one parking space in the carriage house. But it's really not until 1960s, and by that point, obviously cars are very popular, until you start to see this chart here on the right, where it breaks down all the different uses in the city and then the parking requirement for each use. So a lot of the city was developed prior to 1960s, and a lot of the places we like today, like Carytown, West Brooklyn Park Boulevard, those were all developed prior to any off-street parking requirements. So a lot of times the building took up the entire parcel because there's no parking requirements. So again, this is just a very brief overview of the history of parking requirements. And so where we are today is there's that section in the zoning ordinance that's similar to that chart from the 1960s that has progressed over time, and we've made changes to it. But there's that section in the zoning ordinance, and typically for a commercial use, it's determined by floor area. Not all commercial uses, but most of them. And then for residential uses, it's all based on the number of dwelling units. And then over time, we've identified areas throughout the city, again, referencing back to Carytown, Brooklyn Park Boulevard, where we've created these parking overlays where we say maybe the parking requirement doesn't need to be as strict. So instead of 1 per 100 square feet, it could be 1 per 300 square feet. So we have these parking overlay districts and also parking exempt districts where we say no parking is required except for certain uses. And then, as I mentioned about how a lot of the city was developed prior to parking requirements, we have these uses that have been continuous since the parking requirements, and they take up the entire parcel, and there's no off-street parking, which I'll get into more, but we've created these non-conforming parking spaces depending on the location in the building throughout the city. And then we've even created new zoning districts. A lot of it you see downtown in the B4 Central Business District and the TOD, the Transit Oriented Nodal District, where we say no parking is required except for dwelling uses, hotels, and motels. So again, this is kind of a little brief overview. There's many other different regulations that come in, but this is just a general overview of what the parking requirements look like today. And so when we had our initial outreach back in August, we asked the question, so what are some challenges with eliminating parking space minimums? And we heard that Richmond needs better transit before we do this. We heard about the potential for on-street overcrowding of on-street parking, especially those residential areas near commercial uses. We heard they could deter businesses away from the city, and how it could really impact the existing infrastructure when you increase the density. But then we also asked, what are some opportunities if we eliminate parking space minimums? And one of the biggest things we heard was the better utilization of land for businesses, housing, and green space. We know that Richmond is growing in population, but our geographical boundary is not growing at all. We're not annexing any more land. So we have to look at every single parcel of land and what's the best use for each parcel of land. And I think surface parking, we can tell, is probably not the best use of land for a lot of parcels out there. So, but also decreasing the cost of housing. There's studies out there that show that either requiring parking or having a parking space or building parking often in excess can increase the cost of housing. And then also the environmental impact, maybe having people rely on other modes of transportation can help reduce the environmental impact. And it also reduces the administrative burden on this process. There's a lot of people in the community that probably have their own stories of just like the complexity and the confusion with parking space minimums in the city, and just and I'll get into more of like the special approval process, but this is just something that would be wiped away if we eliminated parking space minimums. And so our draft recommendation is to eliminate parking space minimum requirements from the city's zoning ordinance. So I made reference to the section of the zoning ordinance that requires it. So here is that chart that has changed over the past 60 years. So what we're saying is we're not going to prohibit any new parking spaces. We're not going to actively go out and eliminate parking spaces. What we are proposing is that the zoning ordinance will not dictate the minimum number of parking spaces that a business or residential property has to have. So we won't say that restaurant, you have to have 100 or you have to have one parking space per 100 square feet of floor area. We'll let either the developer, the business owner, or the residential property owner determine how many parking spaces they will need on each parcel. So in addition to removing the minimum requirements, we're looking at a lot of other initiatives because a lot of the feedback we heard are kind of fall under these initiatives, whether it's expanding the transit system. We know we have the relatively new Pulse route going west to east, but GRTC was recently funded a study to do a north to south study. So how we can really connect all parts of the city through this rapid transit and also better transit that is not just the Pulse, but you can look at the bicycle lanes. We see them popping up throughout the city, but also improving pedestrian infrastructure, how we can improve the sidewalks, better crosswalks, so people will be encouraged to walk throughout the city. And then also, we know we have some residential parking permit programs throughout the city, but one of our recommendations is to look at what we have existing, what can be changed, and maybe if we can expand upon the parking permit program to kind of help alleviate some of those concerns, especially where you have residential abutting commercial districts. And also assess the curb time limits periodically. You hear people from DC, they say if you park illegally, they get a ticket within 15 minutes. So that's where, as Kevin was mentioning, even though PDR is kind of spearheading this process, we have to work with Public Works and other departments because they're the ones who kind of help manage the on-street aspect of it. So here are just a few of the initiatives, and there's many more that we can go through, but these are the main ones that we're looking at for the parking requirements. And so with these three zoning changes, we really look at Richmond 300 as like our guiding document because it is our guide for growth over the next 20 years. And so for this zoning change, it really highlights all of these topic vision statements in Richmond 300. Talk about creating high quality places, going back to creating these nodes, and the best utilization for land is surface parking, really the best use of land when we create these nodes and places that people really want to be. I don't think anybody saw the surface parking lot was like, oh, this is a really enjoyable place to be. And then creating the equitable transportation aspect of it, it's really focusing on moving people over the movement of vehicles. And then my previous slide talking about expanding transit, bicycle infrastructure. So really how we can encourage people. We know that cars are not just magically going to go away. A lot of people are very dependent on cars. So it's just how can we allow opportunities for different modes of transportation? And then that diverse economy. We love having big corporations in the city, but we also like having those small businesses that make Richmond unique. So allowing that the diverse economy, making it easier for small businesses and having them want to come into the city, because I'm sure you'll hear stories of small businesses that want to come in the city, but they deal with the administrative burden of parking and a lot of other things. So anything that we can do to encourage small businesses to come here. And the inclusive housing, I had talked about how studies show that off-street parking, whether it's structured parking or surface parking, really can increase that housing cost. And for someone who maybe doesn't need a car, they want to live somewhere where maybe it's not required that you have a parking space or it wasn't built in. And just how, because we know there's an affordable housing issue throughout the city. So not requiring a minimum amount of parking spaces per unit and letting the developer dictate that can really help with this topic vision. And then lastly, the thriving environment. I think we know the impact that cars have had on our environment. So just decreasing and encouraging the other modes of transportation can really help thriving environment. So this parking proposed zoning change really highlights all three of these topic vision statements. And some more rationale for eliminating parking space minimums. I gave you a brief overview of how parking or off-street parking space requirements have changed over the decades, but we still find that the current regulations are very onerous and complicated. We're looking at Richmond, or the rewrite of the zoning ordinance. One of our main things is that it shouldn't take a lawyer to figure out what you can do with your property in the zoning ordinance. And the same thing now with the parking requirements. It often is very complex, and we even have lawyers who are looking to do projects in here, and they just don't know all the cross references and just looking at the history of the property. So that's where if we just eliminate the parking space minimum, it makes it much easier and clearer for somebody who wants to open up a business rather than having to go through that whole process. I've highlighted the multimodal mobility aspect a few times here, but really just encouraging people to use other modes of transportation. Whereas if you provide parking every location, then everyone's going to want to drive. So just really encouraging everyone to look at other ways if possible. We talked about the cost savings for businesses and housing, but also the redevelopment of surface parking lots. Back in the 70s and 80s and even 90s in Richmond, the priority was getting people to drive into the city, work, and then leave. So that's why you see all those large surface parking lots throughout the city. But now if we focus on moving people over vehicles and don't have all these requirements, then we can really look at the redevelopment of these surface parking lots. So here you have right downtown in the heart of our city, an entire block of parking right next to the Dominion Tower, which, by the way, the parking requirement for the Dominion Tower was 0 spaces, but they provided over 900 spaces in underground parking. And then I highlighted it before about these non-conforming grandfathered parking spaces, and I'm going to try to do my best to explain it, but it can be very complicated. So these buildings that were established prior to the parking requirements, they, as long as they're continuing their use, they get assigned these grandfathered parking spaces. And these spaces don't physically exist anywhere. They're just imaginary spaces that are assigned to these uses. So this example here on West Carey Street in South Laurel, we have a restaurant use that was established prior to the parking requirements. And so what we do is we look at the floor area and we say, okay, based on the floor area and the requirement, you have 23 non-conforming parking spaces that are associated with this use. Again, even though they don't exist, it's just since that building has been there and since a lot of the city was developed prior to 1960, you come up with a lot of these confusing grandfathered parking spaces. And then if you change the use that is a lesser parking requirement, like to retail, then you would lose grandfathered spaces and you wouldn't be able to go back to a restaurant by right. So if you, in order to build this building today, it would either require 23 off-street parking spaces or it would require a special use permit. So even though the use is allowed, it's just that 23 off-street parking requirement for this use that I think we all would think would not need 23 off-street parking spaces. So this is just one of the many, many, many examples out there throughout the city where you come across these grandfathered parking spaces that are looking at the history of the building and see how it's changed over time. I briefly mentioned getting a special use permit. I just wanted to show the impact that it may have on a development. So this development here over in Scotts Addition, they submitted their SUP in January of 2021, and it got approved in September of 2021. No real opposition. The special use permit was required because they looked at this location and said, we may not need one off-street parking space in our structured parking deck for every single dwelling unit. We're only going to propose 70 parking spaces because we envision people, not everyone's going to have a car. A lot of people are going to be walking. So it required a special use permit. So it took 8 months by the time submittal to approval. And we, in the development community, 8 months is a very, very long time. But in addition to the 70 parking spaces, they looked and said, well, we can provide 38 bicycle parking spaces. Maybe people want to use other modes of transportation there. in this development, if it was just 2 blocks south in a different zoning district, it would meet the parking requirement. And so it's just showing that the zoning district lines, the parking requirement based on the zoning district can be a little complicated, and just it's easy to say, oh, just go get a special use permit, but it really does delay some time, whereas this could have been something that would be by right. And then lastly, one of the things we heard throughout the community engagement was, okay, I'm okay with the small corner business. They shouldn't require parking. I'm okay with the infill small residential, but it's really those large developers. They're going to be greedy. They're not going to provide off-street parking. They just want to make as much money. So what we did was we looked at over 50 residential, commercial, and mixed-use developments that are either constructed and built today, they're approved and under construction, or they're in the proposal process and getting ready to submit an application. So we looked at in several different zoning districts, not just your mixed use districts, but also some the more urban business, and then also some residential office, and then just strictly residential districts as well. And as you can see here, we looked at the development, the proposed number of units, the proposed commercial space, and say, all right, this is what would have been required for the development, and this is what they're providing. So when you add up all those 50 mixed-use developments, you can see there roughly 4,700 off-street parking spaces were required, and they provided 12,646 spaces. So this is over 7,800 off-street parking spaces that were provided in excess of what was required. So we're just hoping this analysis can help alleviate some of that concern that these developers are going to come in and not provide any parking whatsoever, because they have a different process in order to get financing to prove that the parking that they're proposing aligns with the location, the use, and things of that nature. So the elimination of the parking requirement is just for on street. This doesn't apply, or sorry, off street parking, not anything for on street. And I think that's it this time. So at this point, we want to open it up to any questions. Just a few here, just because we have 2 other zoning changes that we want to get through. So
if you have a question and you're on your computer, you can raise your hand, and we will call on you. If you're on your phone, you can just *6, and I'll go to you in a moment. Rachel and Greg, you raised your hand.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I guess my question is, in addition to this mixed use analysis, are you guys also looking at other cities as exemplars, whether it be, I don't know, Chicago? Chicago's a nice mix of drivable as well as bikeable, as well as, public transit friendly, as exemplars about how to maybe, shape the regulations.
Yes, we did look at cities. Thank you for that question. There's several cities across the country that have eliminated parking minimums. One that immediately comes to mind is Buffalo, but I know that there's others as well.
Yeah, we have like obviously larger cities, even like Minneapolis, San Francisco, but smaller cities similar in size to Richmond. So like Raleigh, North Carolina, as you mentioned, Buffalo, and then you're just seeing some or several pop up throughout the community. But one of the things we did look at, like recommendations about how to go from having parking requirements to no parking requirements, is really having that incremental change. And so you don't go from having heavy parking requirements to none at all. And so that's where we, in my example, show that over the past 60 years, we've made many incremental changes. So at this point, that's why we're proposing an elimination of them.
Great, thank you for that addition, Brian. Will, you can unmute and ask your question.
I think that this is a good move, and I was wondering if there is maybe some more drastic changes down the pipeline, maybe something like the elimination of single-family zoning or something similar.
Well, the big thing that we are going to do next is rewrite the zoning ordinance. And so that will be coming, we'll start that process next year in 2023. We haven't explored as it relates to parking at this time, like something that some other groups have done in cities, which is putting in parking maximums, which basically says that you can't provide more than XYZ number per use. But these three big zoning changes, the parking space, eliminating parking requirements, accessory dwelling units, and short-term rentals are kind of the big ones that we're taking on citywide before we dive into the zoning ordinance. Kevin, anything else to add?
No, not in particular. I think in terms of looking at additional housing units, that'll be the next topic we talk about, in accessory dwelling units. So I don't know if there's other questions, but we'll address some of that in the next segment of the presentation.
I see one person who unmuted who's on the phone. I just want to see if you had a question that you want to offer.
Yeah, I thank you for the presentation. It was super clear. I did want to clarify, and I just maybe misunderstood it, but is there going to continue to be parking requirements for hotels and motels?
No, there would be no parking requirements for any use.
Gotcha. Thank you for the clarification.
Seeing no other questions, Brian, why don't you move on to the next one?
Perfect. All right. So the second zoning change we're going to discuss tonight is to permit accessory dwelling units. And for those of you who may not be familiar, what is an ADU? You hear about them all the time, but what is it per definition? It's a smaller independent dwelling unit located on the same lot as another residential structure. So that they have many different types of names. ADU is the most popular one, but they're also in-law suites, granny flats. So all the different names out there you may have heard, that they all are considered these accessory dwelling units. So it has to have a place for eating, sleeping, and sanitation. So it has to have a full bath, a little kitchenette, a place to eat, and then also a place to sleep. And it has to be independent. So it's either separate from the structure, but it's having that independent access to the ADU. And so a lot of us, when we think of these ADUs, we think of the top left here. We think of the accessory structure in the backyard, the garage that's separate from the main dwelling that people want to convert to a living space. But I want to show this slide just to show that there's many other different types of ADUs that we are looking at as we consider making these draft recommendations. So you have the detached, you have an addition to the home, you have an interior upper levels, an interior lower level, like a basement. So some of these ADUs, you look at a house, you may not even know that there's an ADU there, or an above the garage, or even converting your garage. So these are the different types of ADUs that we are looking at. So it's not just the one up here in the top left that everyone thinks about, it's several other ones. In the initial outreach, we asked the community what they thought of allowing accessory dwelling units by right in all zoning districts that permit residential uses. And it was very encouraging to see, as you can see here up, so 0 would be no and 100 is yes. Just seeing that overwhelming support up top to allow these by right. Obviously, we're not going to get 100% consensus on it, but just seeing that overwhelming support was really encouraging. So we asked, are you in favor of allowing by right, but also what regulations should be put in if we do allow them by right? So here are kind of some of the things that we heard in regards to size, setback, and height regulations, design standards, short-term rental regulations, and potentially the number of bedrooms and occupancy. So this is what we heard back in August and September about ADUs. So our staff draft recommendation is to permit one accessory dwelling unit by right on the same property as a single family dwelling in all zoning districts that permit single family dwellings. So you can see here to the map on the right, every place in orange is a zoning district that allows for a single family dwelling. So it can be a single family detached or a single family attached dwelling. But what we're saying is if you have a single family dwelling, you can add that one unit on the property. So as Kevin mentioned in the previous question about are we going to eliminate single family zoning, we thought this was a good approach to allow every single family to add that additional unit. So technically you could have 2 dwelling units on every property that's a single family dwelling throughout the city. So in addition, some of the other recommendations we're looking at is back on my slide showing the different types. We're saying that it can be either an internal conversion, it could be an attached addition, or it could be that detached structure in your backyard. And the biggest thing we wanted to recommend is how do we really make sure that these accessory dwelling units remain accessory to the main single family dwelling. So we did a lot of research out there, and our recommendation was that you look, it really depends on the floor area of the main dwelling. So we're looking at 1/3 of the floor area of the single family dwelling can be the ADU, or 500 square feet, whichever is greater. So if you have 1,000 square foot house and 1/3 is less than 500 square feet, then you can go up to 500 square feet. But if you have a 3,000 square foot house, you can have that 1,000 square foot ADU. So whichever one is greater there, the minimum you could get is 500 square feet, but you could obviously get larger depending on the size of the house. And then we just thought that the ADU must follow the underlying zoning district requirements. So depending on the zoning district, there's different setback requirements, lot coverage. So your enclosed building footprint can't exceed a certain amount of the lot area, and then height. Whether if it's detached, there's the height limit of 20 feet. But if it's attached to the main dwelling, then you're typically looking at the underlying zoning district, which usually is about 35 feet. So we looked at research of other cities that had these ADU regulations come in, but they put so many strict regulations on these ADUs that people weren't building them because it was too strict. They had, oh, you have to be the primary owner, or the ADU can only be a family member, things like that. So we really wanted to have a few recommendations in place that would keep that design aspect and to encourage people to do it, but we didn't want to put too many regulations on it where no one's going to want to build it. They're going to have to get a special use permit regardless. So if you are not able to follow the underlying zoning, or if you're not able to meet the floor area, then it would require special approval separately. So it's just a matter of allowing something by right versus special approval. There's a lot of research out there. ADUs have been around for quite some time. But one of the main things is that it allows a place for an aging parent to stay, or an on-site home for a full-time caregiver. We see this in the city. A lot of people love where they live, but they don't need the size of the house, so they just want to live in the same neighborhood, but just downsize. So this is a great opportunity for that. And going back to the affordable housing and the inclusive housing aspect of it, typically these smaller units are more affordable than a full-size home. So these provide an opportunity for people to live in all neighborhoods throughout the city. An additional source of income. If you have extra space in your backyard, or you want to convert part of your house to an ADU, it allows you to live in the city and help pay for your mortgage or anything else that you can help benefit your income. And going back to Richmond 300 as our guide for all 3 of these zoning changes, but when we had the Richmond 300 process in the inclusive housing, we really heard a lot about allowing these ADUs by right. We heard about it so much that it's specifically referenced in the Richmond 300 in several locations, as you can see here, talking about allowing it as a primary land use in residential neighborhoods and allowing them in all residential zoning districts. So this zoning change derived from the Planning Commission saying, okay, this is what Richmond 300 says. Let's pursue, how do we go about, allowing these by right, but with form-based requirements. So that's going back to the setback, the height, lot coverage, and things like that. And then the Richmond 300 talked about how it allows us to age in place within their neighborhoods. That's all I had for ADUs right now, and we'll be open to a few questions.
Rachel and Greg.
Thank you so much. My only question is, what's the timeline for this revision?
So that's a good question. All three of these are independent ordinances that will be introduced kind of independently. So we are wrapping up the community engagement and comment period. It will end on January 3rd. After that, we'll review all the comments that we got, and then we'll work on developing ordinances to introduce to council. So, you know, the earliest we might introduce something will probably be like February or March, and then it could get adopted about a month later, month and a half. But that's the earliest. It really depends on how many changes we need to make.
Rock on. Thanks so much.
Risha?
Yes, thank you very much. Very great presentation. I had the same question. So it sounds like in March, April of 2023, homeowners can make use of these ADU.
Yes.
Now, it was mentioned that this would allow some income. Would these units, can they be used for businesses? Small home business type?
It really would, they would have to fall under the use that's allowed. So Brian, can you talk about home businesses and residential districts?
So right now, a home occupation, you're allowed to, it would require Board of Zoning Appeals approval if you were to use a detached accessory structure as a home-based business. If it's in your main dwelling, then you can do it by right. Obviously, there are limitations about you can't sell things on site. It limits the visitation. So if you keep that within your main dwelling, you can do it by right. But if it's a detached structure, then that would require Board of Zoning Appeals approval. And it only limits it to like offices, studios for writers and artists and things like that. So if you don't meet that, then they would require a special use permit.
Thank you. That was it. Thanks.
Mason.
Cool, thanks. So the three rules there, are those the only three? I know some areas have instituted like style guides or like pre-approved kind of footprints and styles of these ADUs to build. Is that not part of the Richmond proposal?
So, when you're talking about other places, do you mean other cities or do you mean different parts of our city?
Different cities. Like I know DC has like 3 kind of designs that you can like build right away because they're approved. But like if you have maybe a different style, it might needs to get like looked at before you can build it.
So these are the 3 recommendations. If your property is located in a city old and historic district, the structure would have to go to the Commission of Architectural Review for review, or at least staff review, to make sure it complies with those regulations. We haven't done like those pre-approved designs for detached accessory dwelling units. I do know that DC has done that and Seattle has done that. That could be something we might explore after we adopt the regulations.
Yeah, and going back to some other localities, they putting a lot of restrictions on, it really didn't encourage people to do it. And it's just another line of red tape for people to get through. And I guess another one of our thinking was if you're not in a city old and historic district, and if you just wanted to build a garage in your backyard, there's no design requirements. There's, as long as it meets building code. So we really want these ADUs to kind of blend in. So if you look at it, you could say, oh, that's either a garage or an ADU. So that's why we kind of stayed away from requiring a specific design standard for these ADUs. But yeah, as you mentioned, the pre-approved plans, a lot of other cities, they have these pre-approved plans set to kind of decrease the time it takes to get approval.
And those are more related to, they're not part of the zoning ordinance, but rather they're like separate things that are kind of these pre-approved plans so that people can, get through the building permit review process easier. Because then the building commissioner and his staff are just looking at the same type of plans over and over again rather than different unique things. Janine?
I think I'm just clarifying what you also just re-clarified. So basically, people would just need to make sure that they are complicit with the building codes, but they would not have to apply for a special use permit. It's kind of already guaranteed as long as they meet the setbacks and meet the other requirements you've outlined as far as, you know, bathroom, kitchen kind of thing, and the size.
That's right. That is right.
Okay.
Rachel and Greg?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is in the weeds a little bit, but what are going to be the stipulations regarding bathrooms, kitchens, etc.?
So that will follow the building code. So you'll have to follow, have your architect or whoever's contractor make sure that they're following the building code. That doesn't get regulated through zoning.
Awesome, thank you.
Brooke? Brooke?
Yeah, sorry, it took me a second I just transferred from the phone. Yeah, I think this is great. Again, I understand, nice presentation. I have heard people kind of, throw around, if there's no requirements on style guides or anything like that, is it possible for people to, throw up basically sheds with a toilet in it, or tiny homes, which I'm not against tiny homes. I think that's fine. But, like, are there any restraints where maybe it doesn't really fit with the surrounding neighborhood, or, throwing a mobile home or an RV in the yard? Are there any concerns being raised or considered about things like that?
So I don't think a mobile home would qualify because it doesn't have a foundation. But
that's correct.
Yeah. And then in terms of design, and in terms of like it being a shed, that would would have to meet the building code and be a habitable space. So I don't think a shed would probably qualify. And then as it relates to like the design and aesthetic and like materials that are used and colors, we have our city old and historic districts which regulate those. So in those places, you'd have to follow those rules. But we don't have those rules in other parts of the city. So we thought when we were talking that through, we were like, if you live in a district, in a part of the city that's not a city old and historic district, and you can kind of build whatever house you want as long as it meets zoning and building code, why would we put kind of stricter guidelines for the detached accessory unit when like there are no rules like that for your garage or even your shed or even your house itself, whether you use vinyl or hardy plank or stucco or things that we don't regulate in those parts of our city.
Great, thanks for the clarification. I think the mobile home thing is probably the biggest question, so I appreciate that clarification.
Sure thing. Any questions for people on the phone? Okay. All right, I think we're ready to go to the next one. That's me. So this one is short-term rental regulations. This is a topic that is not without controversy, like the others. My name is Maritza Mercado-Pichin, and I am Deputy Director for Equitable Development with the city. Next. So short-term rentals, for those of you who don't know, it is defined in the Virginia Code as units that are rented for less than 30 days. So that's like Airbnb, Vrbo, HomeAway. I might say STR for short. That stands for short-term rental as I speak. So the current STR regulations that were adopted in 2019 after I think over a year of community engagement about it permits permits them as an accessory use in any zoning district that permits residential uses. So that means it's permitted in lots of zoning districts, because many of our zoning districts allow residential uses. It says that the only property owners who are where it's your primary residence, if that's your primary place that you live, for at least 185 days of the year, that only those individuals may rent their homes and get a permit to operate an STR legally in the city. That it can be the entire unit or just a room, as long as it's a maximum of 5 rooms, and that you have to get a permit every other year. So we heard a lot of feedback. So some people suggested revisions to the existing regulations. Some folks said removing the residency requirement. We also have people who said that it should stay, that we should keep the residency requirement. There's ideas about limiting the number of short-term rentals per neighborhood. So, you know, like the Fan could only have 200. I don't know, I'm picking a number out of a hat, but just limiting it by geography, limiting the number that an individual owner could own, increasing the taxation on short-term rentals. The General Assembly passed some legislation. We can collect the hotel occupancy tax on short-term rentals now, and to not allow short-term rentals at all. So people were like, they shouldn't be allowed, period. Whether or not you live there, you shouldn't be allowed to do a short-term rental, whether or not you live there as your primary residence, or they should be completely prohibited in certain neighborhoods. There's some ideas of like, suggestions were made about streamlining the process to get a permit, reducing the fee. Right now, the fee is $300 every 2 years. There was also, the people talked about there need to be more staffing in the city departments that manage this program, requiring the units to become inspected, and then getting more involvement from the STR operators, so having them, or companies rather, having them give over the names and the contact information for all of the units that are being rented in the city. So these are draft recommendations, and like Kevin said at the beginning, they're draft, and this is kind of a place for us to start the conversation. So we want to hear your comments, and we want you to fill out our online comment form. Today we really want to talk about questions that are clarifying, but we want you to definitely give us your comments on these. So right now, what we're thinking about is that if it is your primary residence, if it's the place where you live most of the time, that you are allowed to do an STR by right as an accessory use. And that's if it's in a residential district, so if you live in an R district, or if your primary residence is in another district. Now, if it is not your primary residence, if the building is not where you normally live, and the property and the building is in an R district, we're saying that you could be allowed to have a short-term rental, but there couldn't be another non-primary residence STR within a certain distance. We don't have those exact distances ironed out. We wanted to see what people thought of this idea before we kind of figured out all the details of it. But what would probably happen is that the distance would become greater in areas where the parcels are much larger. And then they would be allowed, non-primary residents would be allowed without a distance requirement in non-residential zoning districts. There's a little bit of an extra layer on this, and that's related to multifamily dwellings. So those are buildings that have 3 or more units. We're proposing that only 1/3 of those units and a maximum of 10, whichever is lesser, would be permitted as short-term rentals. So if that multifamily building is a building that you live in, you could rent a unit out by right. But if it is a building that you do not live in, and that multifamily building is located in an R district, so in a residential district, then you could only rent one of the units as long as there wasn't another non-primary resident unit STR nearby. If that multifamily building is in a non-residential district, you could only do 1/3 or a maximum of 10 units. We're trying to figure out how to balance the desire for short-term rentals to exist in our city and the fact that there's affordable housing like crisis happening across our country, and Richmond is not immune to that. And trying to make sure that neighborhoods feel like a neighborhood where you can ask your next door neighbor for a cup of milk when you need it for a recipe. The operations and those two bullets, it's the same as what we currently have on the books, so I'm not going to go into those. The next slide talks about administrative recommendations. The permit fee will be the same, obtained every other year. We'd like additional staffing for permitting and enforcement. We want to add a fine and or a penalty for non-compliance if you do not get a short-term permit and you are found in violation. In Nashville, if they find that you are operating without a permit, they give you time, I think like 30 days to get a permit, and if you do not get it, then you are not allowed to host a short-term rental. You're not allowed to use your unit as a short-term rental for a full year. And then if you're still found in non-compliance, they take you to court, or I think then they say it's 3 years, and then they take you to court, and someone's actually ended up in jail in Nashville over this. We want to be able to collect the transient occupancy tax, the hotel tax, and we'd like to have an inspection for STRs. So this aligns with the master plan. We're trying to align with the master plan 2 different goals, and one of them is trying to develop tourism and attractions and like continue to attract visitors and places for people to stay throughout the city. And then we're also trying to balance it with this need of housing. We want to make sure that we have housing for people to live permanently in Richmond, not just pass through. And so trying to balance those 2 in a way that is equitable and fair. And this is a map that shows, this is about a year ago, STRs throughout the city. You can see that most of them are concentrated in the places that are the most dense parts of our city and also closest to most of the attractions that people would want to be near. So the next steps for this whole process is we're going to have an in-person meeting. So if you want to see us, what we look like in the flesh, you can come to the meeting and hear this all again, or you can, if you know someone who should definitely hear about this and see it in person, please invite them to come to that meeting next Tuesday at 6 p.m. at the main library over on Franklin Street. We're going to be collecting comments from people via our online comment form. It's on our website. If you Google RVA Gov 3 zoning changes, you'll find it. And the comment form is really helpful for us because it's a really easy way for us to like see everything in one place. You can also email us. We will read your email, but it would be great if you use the comment form over email. And then after we kind of gather the comments and read them all, we'll start working on drafting the separate ordinances and bringing them to the Planning Commission and Council. So the next slide asks you to evaluate the meeting. If you type in bit.ly @3z eval, you'll get a little survey just asking us for you to evaluate how we did running this meeting so that we can get better as we continue to host meetings on various topics. So let's do some questions about short-term rentals. And then if we have time after that, we can open it up to other questions that you might have had on the other topics. Janine?
Thank you. I live in the Churchill section of Richmond. At the present time, I live across the street from 6 buildings that are each quad buildings. Mm-hmm. First thing I'll say is you would think that because those buildings are so small that in each of those quads it would be only one person, but sometimes it's like 3 people. So you multiply that out. But considering that some of the owners own more than one quad, how many STRs can we end up with on that block at any given time, given your formula? Because right now it's a little crazy. I mean, even with the evictions, sometimes I already feel like we have STRs, but that's a whole nother matter.
Yeah. So hypothetical block in Churchill with 6 quads on it. So that would be 24 units on there.
Correct.
So if one of the buildings is owner occupied, or any
None of them are.
Okay. None of them are. So probably there could be 1 STR, because there would be a distance requirement saying that there could only be a short-term rental in a residential district that's not a primary residency if another one is far away.
When you say 1, would that mean 4 out of that 1 quad, or
It would be
1
out of the 24.
1 out of the 24? Okay, that sounds a lot better to me than what I had imagined.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Grady?
Hey, Maritza, and hey, everybody. My name is Grady Hard. I am president of the Rosedale Civic Association on the north side. I want to just start briefly just saying I appreciate everything that you all are doing to help get a lot of feedback on these. I think the community engagement on this has been pretty good, and appreciate the opportunity. With that said, for short-term rentals, I'm going to continue to push us on this. I think that we need to be setting these up with local residents in mind. So people who live in Richmond, who want to call Richmond home, people who want to buy homes long-term, people who want to rent homes longer term, that's who we really need to keep in mind. And to me, the current version of what these regulation changes would be does not do that in a strong enough way. From what I can tell, it looks like somebody could very easily come in and buy 30 properties as long as they space them out far enough from each other and turn every single one of them into a short-term rental. We are in the midst of an affordable housing crisis in Richmond. It's bad. I have plenty of friends who cannot afford a home, who cannot afford to buy, who cannot afford to rent. I really love Richmond, and I think a lot of people do. For the folks who want to live here, have families here, and really be here for the long term, we cannot set ourselves up to become a place where our regulations are so lax on short-term rentals that those folks get pushed right out of the city. And it's already happening for a variety of reasons. So I would just ask that, in my opinion, I think we need to keep the primary residency requirement. If we decide to do away with that, then I think at the very least we need to maximize not just looking at a spatial limit, but a number of units that a person can purchase in Richmond and turn into short-term rentals. And I would place that maximum at no more than 1. So if they want to own 5 homes in Richmond, that's fine, but only 1 of them can be a short-term rental. So again, really appreciate everything y'all are doing, and thanks for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Grady, for the comments. Thomas.
Hey, is it open for discussion?
I'll come to you right next on the phone. I'm going to take Thomas next, and then I'll get back to you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hey, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Hey, I just wanted to start by saying I really appreciate the administrative recommendations you had for STRs. I think a hotel tax, inspections, everything you had on that slide, excellent. I think those are all really great. We should definitely do everything we can to have those. The question I have is how confident do you feel about the distance requirements and building out a way to do that? Have other localities done distance requirements with STRs, and How do they do it? Or maybe could you produce a slide that kind of explains how that would work? And because it seems to me like it would very quickly break down into a mad rush for people to get in and buy as many properties as they can, because it seems to me like you're saying you're going to do a voucher system without a voucher system, and it's just the voucher is the fastest one to draw in a scenario where there's a distance requirement. Or maybe I'm not understanding it. So
Yeah, so the distance requirement is something that is one of the ideas that we learned about through the American Planning Association, and we wanted to kind of test out that idea before we spent a lot of time figuring out how we would administer it and how we would, prevent that mad rush like you mentioned, and so that's where we are right now. Like, we haven't created the chart yet of what the distances would be between for different zoning districts. But yeah, anything, Kevin or Brian?
I think depending on, policy decisions, I think, looking at if the recommendation is to allow for non-owner occupied short-term rentals, I think that's one, kind of first policy decision to make. And if that is recommended, then I think from an administration perspective, then we would provide some additional details about how they would be spaced, which I think, Maritza said, perhaps in areas with smaller parcels, they could be closer. In areas with larger parcels, they may be further apart. But then I'll say just the system of how do you allocate, right, that first batch? And that is, you have a certain deadline, and by that time, it's a lottery, or is it just first in time? I mean, we'd have to have some of those further discussions. I think it's a little premature exactly right now, but those are things that we've been discussing internally, depending which way the recommendations move forward. But there are a variety of ways that we would look at administering it that way. And as we said, that's one approach in terms of the distance requirement. Others have just like a set number of, say, 100, 200, 300, give a number, and award those via lottery, but those could all cluster in a certain area. We felt that the distance approach was germane really to prevent that clustering, because you see right now, naturally, the demand is for those to be in some certain neighborhoods. And so to prevent that clustering, we felt the distance approach was the best way to ensure health, safety, welfare.
But the distance would only apply to non-owner occupied. So you could have still maybe 10 on the same block, as long as they were owner occupied. And then like I don't know. Maybe I'm not smart enough, but it sounds like it would get really complicated really fast, having to determine between the owner occupied, and then you have people who aren't even participating in the enforcement program. But anyways, I'll stop talking. It just sounds very complicated to me, and I'd love to see a slide that explains it. And I know you guys aren't there yet, and that was all my comment was.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you for that feedback, because we don't have all the answers. This isn't all totally finished, and so kind of hearing as we work in our conference room to come up, read everything that we've heard, digest the focus groups that we hosted, and like how all that went. We bounce ideas off of each other, and this is a point where we're ready to share it with people, and then this is the kind of feedback we want to hear so that we can make us better and more clear policy decisions that we would actually recommend for adoption. Let's go to the phone.
Hi, this is Megan here.
Hi, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Hey, so my husband and I have been in Richmond. Well, we were Richmond residents until this past year. My husband is in the Army, and he actually became activated on Title X orders. So we'd been residents since 2017. And we had a life change that has kind of required us to be away from Richmond for the past few years. And we are currently Airbnb-ing our property in the Stratford Hills neighborhood. And the reason why we chose to Airbnb versus to sell or to long-term rent our property is because we love our neighbors and our neighborhood so much. And short-term renting it allows it to block us the house for us to come and visit with our daughter who's 5 months old and still be part of our neighborhood. We also, with the baby, we moved closer to family, so we bought another house outside of Richmond, and we hope to eventually move back into Richmond in the next couple of years once my extended family's healthcare issues resolve. But I just wanted to speak here. I know that everyone's afraid of everything being in a short-term rental and these big commercial investors moving in, but the owner occupant would really hurt families like us who are military or travel nurses from being able to rent out our homes. And I do think there should be rules. I love permits, and I think for the safety of everyone, there should be inspections to make sure there's enough exits, that there's not too many people sleeping in a residence. That way the fire and the police are aware that it's a short-term rental and it's operating as such. But I don't think that arbitrage should be allowed, meaning like I don't think that I should be able to hire a third party to operate my home. I think that if you own the property, whether you're a primary, resident or not, if you own the property and you're operating it and you're the one that's running the day-to-day operations and you have a stake in the property, then that should be allowed. Because I know when my neighbors call me and say, hey lady, they're parking on the street, I'm immediately on the phone with whoever's in my home and I'm telling them to get in the driveway. And if they can't get in the driveway, then I call the police, because these are my rules and I need them to respect my neighbors, and I need my neighbors to be able to walk with their dogs and their children safely on the street because they're my friends. And I've been a member of that neighborhood since 2017. And also just, I wanted to throw it out there because you never know what life circumstance is going to kind of get thrown at you. And with the population aging, like I'm very thankful that you guys allow ADUs. Our home is a split level. We recently had a family member become ill who's unable to do steps. So if we could convert our garage into a wheelchair accessible ADU, that would be incredible for our family. But it's not all bad people. It's not all people just trying to get money. You never know what life circumstance you're going to have. And if you could allow it to be open to owners, I don't think these, 200 unit apartment building owners should be allowed to do it. I think that would hurt the, affordable housing in Richmond. But if you could at least open it up to people who own the property and operate themselves, it would really be helpful to families like us.
Great. Thank you for the comments on that. I don't think there was a question there for us to answer, but thank you for the comments. Brooke?
Yeah, thanks, Marissa. I think on this one, I would have to say that I do kind of lean in with the comments that Grady from the Rosedale Association noted about like really making the local residents first. And I'm actually kind of empathetic to the last caller because, my instinct is to say like, yeah, we want owner occupancy. We want somebody who's there on site. And I have empathy for that caller and like where you're at and that makes sense. But I do think there's got to be some way to block people from coming in, buying up a lot of property, not even being here in the city. If you can have local residents or people who have, I don't know how to thread that needle. That's probably a really hard corner case to account for. But, what I'm concerned about are just, folks from the outside buying up large swaths of property and turning them into ADUs and rentals and, subdividing multiple houses and getting the whole thing set up as just a rental fest. I think that's probably the worst case scenario and would be disruptive to communities. So,
yeah.
Anyway.
I hear you, Brooke, and that's something that we've also kind of talked about as staff is how do we, people don't move to neighborhoods in our city so that they have like a hotel running on their block. So just trying to balance that, all those different needs with this relatively new technology.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and and just to add in, I think the distance requirement is also, I'm curious how it would play out. I could see that becoming a pretty quick arm wrestling match between neighbors of like, wait, I was here first. I had one. You have one. Whatever. Again, I think that actually works better if you're actually talking about local residents that are the owners and they actually live there versus somebody coming in and swapping, scooping up a whole neighborhood and nobody else that actually lives there can participate.
Right. Kevin?
Sure. I was just going to say, I think one of the things that we wrestle with in terms of, the ability to regulate non-owner occupied properties is that we are not allowed to decide who gets to come in and buy property. And so whether it's a Richmond resident buying another parcel in the city, or whether it's somebody from Henrico or Chesterfield, or whether it's somebody from across the globe, we cannot, through zoning, make any distinctions about who is buying that property. So I think that's one of the challenges we look at in terms of, giving preference to Richmond residents. That is not something that's allowed through the zoning code, and that is we have to be ambivalent, agnostic in terms of who is actually purchasing that property and operating it as a short-term rental. We are not allowed to make distinctions whether it's a resident or not for those non-owner occupied ones. So I just wanted to, kind of put that out there in terms of something that we can't put forth just because it's not allowed legally.
But it would be allowed if you guys left it as the residency requirement.
Yeah, in terms of if we're retained as is right now, that you would have to be a resident of your home. That is something that has stood up, and that, again, through these policies, we'll be having further discussions with our city attorney's office on it. But as we left it right now, then it would require you to be a resident in order to use your property in this particular manner. Yes.
Right. Rachel and Greg?
Hey, thanks so much. I know we're being handsy. So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly, is that you can't differentiate between corporate entities and individuals in terms of the way that you regulate the use of their property. Is that correct?
Yes. I think if you have to look at the regulations of if you were to say imposing a limit that you could have, or an entity could only operate one or have one, you can set numerical regulations, but you can't start defining whether or not it's an individual, a resident, a corporation that could be operating that. That makes sense in terms of the distinction?
Yes.
Okay.
I would just encourage you to keep that in mind. I think that would be one of the dividing lines in terms of the scenario we're trying to avoid and the scenario we're trying to encourage.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, rock on, man.
Mario?
Yes, hello, good evening. So in terms of the short-term rentals and the spaces, the edifices, the ADUs that people can use in their backyard, you mentioned something about performing some type of inspection. These inspections, are they only going to be associated to like she sheds and male sheds? What about those unique spaces that are often on Airbnb, such as tents and yurts? How would you inspect those? What are the qualifications for those?
So there's a line there that we need a little further investigation on. A tent. There's other things in which people sleep that are technically not dwelling units. And so we would have to have some conversations about distinctions about using those facilities, because if they're not an actual dwelling unit, then they don't, building code doesn't apply, and technically, they're not allowed for habitation. And there's a whole separate thing that talks about, right, tents and campers and recreational vehicles that have a purpose. but in terms of being an actual dwelling unit, they don't fall that way under the building code. I think you bring a very interesting point that we've preliminary discussed, but I think we'll need to provide some additional research and feedback on that before we move forward, because I think that is an important distinction. I think one of the concerns that just would need to be addressed with things that aren't a dwelling unit have to come with really, sanitation, and that is maybe you don't necessarily need a cooking unit when you're staying somewhere, but you do need a place to wash up, use the facilities, and those types of things. So that will be a consideration in terms of, while you may have like a tent or a camper or something, how is the sanitary end accounted for? And that would be something that I think we'll come back with in some of these further recommendations and administration.
And Kevin, I believe the definition in the zoning ordinance, the short-term rental definition does make reference to like a dwelling unit. So that's how we kind of capture, it has to be a dwelling unit and not something that's not a dwelling unit.
Thank you.
Janine?
A couple of further questions that people have got my line working. As far as inspection, would that be a one-time thing, or would that be done when they recertify every other year? And also, if it comes down to being owner occupied, if the owner decides to leave and live someplace else within that time period of 2 years, how is that, known by you guys? Is that an honor system where they say, oh, I moved out, I'm giving up my STU, or is it just that it's up to the neighbors to become snitches if they start having problems with, parking or noise or sanitation? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. On the inspection one, I don't know. I guess I'd want to look at like what regulations that exist for hotel buildings. So we would hire a third party group probably to help us administer this, and so they would help us identify all of the listings that are active, and then we would be sending people violation notices or notices that they have to, come in, get a permit within X number of days. So that would help us administer it. I guess if someone stops operating it, I guess technically the permit would carry with the building, unless it's your primary occupancy, and then if it's your primary dwelling, it's where you live most of your life, most of your time, and then you don't live there and you sell it to someone who doesn't live there, well, then they couldn't operate a short-term rental.
Well, I mean, if you don't sell it, but you just end up, you're living someplace else, but you still own it.
Yeah, but then you come back in 2 years to get a renewal and you would not pass. Yeah, so I guess there would be a time period there where you would be technically illegal because we don't know where you live. But yeah, Kevin?
Yeah, I think, with that, we would look at, just from an administrative perspective, of setting, the appropriate time for how long these permits would be good for. And there'd be a certain checklist of things that you needed to do to get your permit, and potentially the same checklist or another thing you needed to do to get a renewal. And so with that, if somebody would, like you said, move out during that time, the period, the permit was active, we would operate on a complaint basis. And if 3 months after they moved out, somebody complained and said they're not living there anymore, we would follow up with an inspection and found out if that was the case, then we would most likely, revoke the permit. In terms of, I think our proactive administration would be on the permit cycle, and that is however long the terms would be established. Those would be set in that administration of what things would be required to, one, start it up, and two, continue that use, whether they're the same or maybe a lesser checklist would be needed for renewal.
unmuted. Next question again is Brooke.
Great. Sorry for the follow-up, but following up on Mario's question about tents and yurts, it actually opens up a really good thread because I do know there are some properties in the area. I'm south of the river where they have tree houses and things like that that are kind of interesting Airbnb uses. And so it is a real possibility. I know earlier you said with ADUs that mobile homes aren't allowed, but then it sounded like what Brian's comments, if I got it right, was that tree houses, campers, tents aren't covered under the code, but that, did I hear you right, Brian, that the way that the rules would work with Airbnb, you would have to have an actual livable residence in order to rent? Like, would that eliminate the possibility for yurts and tents, or are we saying that that's just not covered?
Yeah, and that's where, and I believe if you look at the definition in the zoning ordinance for short-term rental, we can, if I believe it's in there, but if not, we can put in there that it has to be a dwelling unit. And so sometimes, and when we do the short-term rental permit right now, we do the research to make sure that it's a legal dwelling unit. So like if you have a basement conversion or like an ADU in the detached garage, we make sure that there's a CO on file that shows that there's that separate livable unit there. So you wouldn't get a CO for a tent or a yurt or a treehouse because it doesn't meet the definition of a dwelling unit.
Gotcha. And actually, this leads me, I'm sorry, for another follow-up. Because right now the regulations are such that you can't have a second kitchen in your home because it turns it into a duplex that it would be illegal currently. I actually do have an in-home mother-in-law suite that I put on Airbnb. And by the way, I owe you guys a permit. I didn't know. I mean, I do now, but anyway, on that front, I have it set up as a kitchenette. There's no oven, there's no stove because that would be illegal currently. Do I now have to install one in order to rent it out, or can I leave it as a kitchenette, which is typically pretty acceptable on Airbnb?
No, you don't have to install one in order to rent it out. But with the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, if that were to be adopted, you could install a full kitchen legally within that unit, most likely.
Great. Thank you for both of those clarifications.
No, I appreciate them being brought up because I think one of the things that, again, in the administration, as we go in the code with both zoning code and building code, is ultimately, right, we can give authorization to do certain things if they fall under those codes. But we all know that people have the ability to rent out things that aren't, technically dwelling units. And so how do we look at the ability to regulate those, if possible, really, to ensure health and safety?
Yeah, because right now, in order for the STR permit, you have to provide a floor plan. You have to show where the fire extinguishers are, the carbon monoxide things are. So that's where, and if someone tries to submit that with a tent, it's not going to work.
So then,
Any other questions?
Go
ahead.
Yeah, is there any way to apply for like a special use circumstance for people like us who were residents for a long time? And I actually am one of the people who paid for the permit when it first came out, and I never received an inspection nor a permit, and my money was never refunded. So because I am all for regulations. I think, I'm a nurse, and my background's in EMT. And I do think it's very important for our local municipalities to inspect these places where people are paying to stay for safety of both the inhabitants inside in the event of a fire and emergency. And that way, too, our first responders know what they're getting into when they arrive at a scene. But is there any way to apply for like an exemption or a special use or anything like that? Just because, I still own the home. It's no longer my primary residence, but is there any way to kind of apply for a grievance? That way, it's not like some corporation that's trying to do it, or, someone from outside the area. Because I feel like people are just afraid of there being no homes available. And that's what it sounds like, and they're being like ragers. But currently, it's not very well regulated in Richmond, and there's quite a few all over. But it takes up less than 1% of the U.S. housing population.
Brian or Kevin, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So a few things. One, if you did apply for something and didn't get a response, please email me, kevin.vonk@rva.gov, so I can track that down and figure out what happened with that.
Yeah.
In terms of, I think one of the things that
how do I spell your last name? Sorry.
Vonk, V as in Victor, ONCK @rva.gov.
Okay. Thank you.
And, one of the things that we're discussing today is, proposal to do things in our ordinance. I'll say a lot of these by right. And that is what is an administrative process where you just need to apply for a permit and we go through, check the boxes to make sure you comply. And then they're able to award that permit, approve that permit for you to be able to do something. We do know there are some exceptions. So one of the things that we've talked about is, with this, there are ways that we would maybe have an offshoot for a conditional use permit, or we have in the city a special use permit, and that is, instead of being administrative, it's legislative. And so there's a fee to go through, and you describe what you intend to do and how you would like to vary from what is written in the zoning ordinance. And there's a public process. There's engagement, public notice, and the planning commission then makes a recommendation to our city council, who ultimately decides whether or not to grant that special use. So there is a path and a process for, I'll say, exceptions and one-offs. What we're trying to do is establish the bar for what will be the norm for most cases. But I think one of the things we look at is just different ways, but there is that alternative special use, not just for this, but for all types of uses in the city that don't fit into the zoning code.
Okay. Yeah, and I will say too, this happened in my parents' neighborhood in Pennsylvania, where they quote unquote outlawed short-term rentals, and their personal property value also dropped 18% after that ordinance was passed. My parents are getting ready to retire next year, and when they got their home reappraised for sale, they were trying to figure out why it dropped. This was before the market correction as well. And basically what the bank said was there's less of an interest in their market due to regulations coming down the pipe. So that's just something to throw out there for people who are very afraid of short-term rentals, is it actually can negatively impact, your home value as well. But for us, I just want to make sure I have a couple of families that go to the Cancer Institute at Massey that have 11 radiation treatments left. And I just want to know what to tell them. Like, do they have my home to come and stay at during their treatments for the rest of the year, or do I have to turn them away? So it's kind of the biggest thing now, because they, don't want to go to a hotel with no immune system. So it's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that kind of perspective. It's always good to have people who are operating the uses on the calls, so that we can think about how to shape the policy. So are there any other questions for people on the phone or joining us virtually? Great. Well, seeing none, I just want to thank everyone for spending 90 minutes of your Thursday night talking about zoning, which we love to do because we studied it for our careers. But you guys probably don't know it as much, maybe didn't. So thank you so much, and please provide your comments and share the information with people that you know who may be interested, and hopefully we'll get to meet some of you guys soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Thank you.